Hey everybody, Brett from AstartesGaming here, back with another Mount Blade 2 Bannerlord developer blog video. Today we're going to be checking out the developer blog for October 5th, 2017. This is the first dev blog for October, and we're finally getting at least a little bit of what we've asked for. This is entirely focused on single player, although really just one element in single player. They're going to be focusing primarily on influence, but also a little bit on how campaigns work. So when they say armies, they're referring to what we would think of as campaigns from Warband. So let's go ahead and dive in. Blah, blah, blah. Again, they wanted to discuss single player because that's what we've been asking about. They're going to basically discuss mechanics in their own dedicated blogs. So over time they hope to cover basically everything. But I don't mind that. Again, I do want to hear about everything, and it's really tempting to just ask for it all in one blog. But obviously if they break it up, they can go into more depth on each thing. So I'm okay with that. Although it is difficult to be patient for it sometimes. So there is a previous blog that discusses how influence works. This is going to be more how it applies to this specific setting. Again, that setting being the campaign armies. So they're sort of just summarizing the previous blog. Influence acting as currency. It's earned by saving or by serving your kingdom. So attacking bandits, enemy parties, raiding enemy fiefs, capturing enemy fiefs. It's very similar to if you've played or watched my 12th mod for Warband, the exploit in that. It's very similar. Although in that mod, I think you spend it on like equipment, where in this you're using it in a more or for less tangible things. And influence can be spent to determine the outcome of some faction decisions. So my assumption would be like, you know, when you're playing Warband and you're a lord in a kingdom, and you can kind of go around and ask like, who do you think should be given this fief? And basically say like, oh, you want to nominate yourself, or you can agree with them, or you can say nothing and then go agree with somebody else. In decisions like that, I imagine you could spend influence to be like, hey, well, why don't you, support me? And I'll throw like, 80 influence at it, or however much it costs. So those are the faction decisions. I would think, something like that. And then also making requests to allied lords, which I guess sort of falls into that as well. They've already shown that influence can be spent to ask an allied lord to follow you, but one thing we have yet to discuss is how players can use our new army gathering system to perform this action on a grander scale. So I read these beforehand so that I have some idea of what I'm talking about when I cover them, and it almost sounds like marshals are going to be obsolete. I don't think they're. Maybe they are, and let me rephrase that. So it sounds from reading this, and you guys will kind of see as we go, that marshals might be obsolete. However, it may be that, like, as being a marshal or something, you don't have to spend influence for all the things they're about to cover. They don't talk about marshals in this, so it's difficult to say. But let's cover it, and then I'll kind of readdress that point. So how does it work? Each allied lord has an influence cost based on the power of their party. Players can spend their influence points to summon allied lords to form their own army. It is the leader of the army which gains all of the influence for the army's victorious deeds. For example, capturing a city will result in a huge influence boon for the leader. So spending influence to build an army is actually an investment, and sometimes even a gamble, because if you spend all that influence and then you lose, then you're out a lot of influence. If an army leader can no longer afford to spend influence, then the army will start to disband. Alright, so army influence upkeep costs is based on several factors. So the higher the morale, the lower the upkeep costs. The lower the morale, the higher the upkeep costs. Distance from hometowns, and how long you've been fighting for. This is cool because I think this will be a really good balancing mechanic, meaning that it will be fairly inexpensive to form up defensive armies, but very expensive to form up offensive armies. Because you have to keep in mind, if you're defending something, you should be able to call up lords fairly quickly. You're within your own kingdom, and so the other lords should be around. Whereas if you want to go on the offensive, you need to call everybody up and then travel, and that takes time. So in Warband, for example, and you guys may feel this way, you may not, but there's not really defense in Warband. Basically, it's we're going to form a campaign, go take your city, you're going to form a campaign and take it back, and it's basically just a back and forth on offense. There's no real like defending in Warband, at least on the sort of grander kingdom scale. Obviously there's people fighting defensive battles in those cases, but you don't really see a campaign rallying to go run another campaign off, at least not very often. I think I've seen it once in like all of the campaigns that I've played, or all of the that's probably not the right or the best word for it in this case, but you guys, I think you know what I mean. So and then relations between the army commanders and lords. So obviously somebody that likes you is going to require a little bit less influence to come along than somebody that hates your guts. As long as the army is successful in their efforts and the lord commander is keeping the other lords happy, then the army can go on marching for a long time. But if things don't go well, the army will quickly dissolve and lords will decide to abandon the campaign and return to their own lands. When an army is gathered, it becomes almost like a moving settlement with its own UI overlay on the campaign map. The UI will show army morale, lords and their parties, food supply, and marching speed. So one thing to note is that food supplies in these campaign armies are shared, so it basically all just gets pooled together. Everybody that brings food is going to contribute, and everybody that doesn't is going to be like a leech. So the UI also shows portraits of the lords, which are currently a part of the army, and their current relations with the player. Deep red means that they despise you, whereas bright green means that you are their favorite drinking buddy. If a lord has answered the summons and is traveling to join your army, or if they are currently away from the army on a mission, their portrait will appear grayed out with an indication, or with an indicator displaying their distance from the army's current position, which is measured in days of traveling time. If you are an army commander, you can click on a portrait to talk with the lord and give them a task to perform, such as scouting ahead, bringing food, bringing reinforcements, or bringing horses, or etc. You can dismiss lords to send them back to defend their lands, or to trim the army and better manage your influence upkeep costs. So obviously you want to be running these things like lean and mean. You don't want to bring a bunch of lords you don't need. If you can probably take a castle with like you and one other lord, then you really don't want to be bringing along any additional lords, because you're just wasting your influence at that point, and probably slowing yourself down too. If you are a member of an army, the army commander or other lords might have their own missions for you. So another aspect of the new, also worth pointing out, because I don't know that you could do this, it may have been added in like diplomacy mod or something, but when you are a lord and an AI lord is marshal, they give you quests all the time, but that's not something that you could really do in the reverse situation, at least not that I've seen. It's pretty rare that I end up a marshal of a kingdom. Usually I'm only a lord until I'm strong enough to go start my own kingdom, so admittedly that's not something I have a ton of experience with, and this might not be true, but in my small amount of experience, I've never seen the ability to really issue quests and tasks to other lords as the marshal. Now, when you become king, there's certain things you can tell them to do, like go defend this place. You should be able to go attack this place. But as marshal, I don't remember seeing those options. Another aspect of the new army system is that armies use pooled resources to support their campaigns. This means that if one lord brings some food, butter, for instance, of course, then the rest of the army will be fed. Likewise, horses and mules are shared, increasing the movement speed of the entire army. So that's worth noting that Horses and mules are going to factor in. Not just the ones that you're actually riding into battle, but they will sort of form like your baggage train or whatever, and that will dictate how quickly you can get around on the map. So this new system allows for all lords to call on other allied lords and build their own army. Because of the large influence costs, it is of course easier for a king to do this. However, there will certainly be times when some powerful lords will have more influence and money than their liege and will be able to amass their own powerful armies to take on a campaign. It also makes it possible for players to try their hand at army management relatively early in the game before they have had a chance to climb to the top of a kingdom. Okay, so we feel that the new influence in army gathering systems better simulate the historical feudal system. When the player becomes part of an army, but part of a kingdom, excuse me, they have obligations to their liege. This system allows players to pay for the benefits of being a lord by supporting their liege and fellow lords in military campaigns while building up influence within the realm to serve their own purposes. And that's the end of it. So, as I said at the beginning, or toward the beginning, this seems to sort of make marshals obsolete. They, again, don't mention them at all here, so I don't know if they've just been done away with entirely, or they just didn't think it was relevant. I think it's very relevant, because obviously this before was something that only the marshal could do in Warband. And so they've basically opened up to anybody who has enough influence to, pull it off. And I like this system a lot. I think it'll make the wars in the game more dynamic. Because again, in Warband, you basically just have one faction starts a campaign, they go and take something, and then they all run off back home. Another faction, or the other faction, starts up their campaign, and they'll probably take back whatever they lost, or maybe they'll go after a different town or something instead. And it's basically just a back and forth, campaign forms, take something, go home. Other campaign forms, take something, go home. And so with this, I think rather than seeing one campaign on each side at a time, with most of the lords present, we're going to be seeing lots of small ones doing more like independent things. And I think, again, that's going to make the wars a lot more dynamic, because you could have like 3 lords off, in one area, another group of 3 lords off in another doing something offensive, and then maybe another group of lords rallying to defend whatever another kingdom's trying to attack. And so I just want to know if marshals are still a thing, because, again, this does sort of make them seem obsolete. And if they are, I think a way to keep them from becoming obsolete is either like significantly reduce or remove any sort of influence they have to spend, because that is their job to like run these armies. And so, I mean, you could argue that maybe they still should have influence, because obviously an ineffective marshal shouldn't really, in reality, if the marshal wasn't effective, people wouldn't follow him, unless like they had some other reason to fear not following him, whether the king is like a tyrant or something. But I think that if they are going to use marshals, it should at least be a reduced influence cost, and that way you'll have the marshal maybe holding a little bit more clout than these other lords running around. But I do like the idea of like powerful lords, like a lord that's basically risen even above his liege in terms of power and influence, being able to sort of like go take a bunch of lords and do his own thing, and the king's just kind of like sitting there like, what am I supposed to do? It would be cool too if, because you get into that idea and then you start thinking like, oh well, what if there's like a rebellion or something? Like, obviously if this lord is more influential than the king, couldn't he sort of like turn around and lead all these lords against the king? So I'll be interested to see how that plays into it as well, because that's not something that you can really do in Warband. It doesn't really flow that well. Basically, in Warband, if you want to start a rebellion, you yourself have to rebel, and then hopefully by the time you've done that, you've made a bunch of friends in your kingdom, and you can invite them individually to come join your kingdom, but it's sort of like a one at a time thing and not like a sort of like sub faction within this kingdom that you can flip and turn against the king. So I'll be interested to see like how other mechanics play into this, but I do like where they're going with it. I think it's a good idea. Again, I just wish they had mentioned a few things from the old warband system that relate to this, because we don't really know. Are they going to get carried over? Are they just irrelevant now? It would have been nice to know. Anyways, that's it for today. So I'll see you guys back here next week for the next blog. But thank you so much for watching. I had a great time talking about some Bannerlord with you, and I look forward to seeing you guys back here for the next video.